Good afternoon. I had hoped to be doing this presentation live, but unfortunately I'm feeling under the weather, so sharing this video instead. I hope I can join you in the chat during the presentation time. I'm Treshani Perera, my pronouns are she, her. Hopefully you heard my bio, so I won't repeat anything else. This is project management from the middle, practical strategies for managing inherited projects. I will say that I'm a minimalist when it comes to slides. So if you'd like to see more text to follow along with what I'm saying, hopefully the closed caption button will be helpful to see some text to go along with the minimalist screen. A raw transcript will appear in a separate panel. So why this presentation? Why is it important to talk about project management for inherited projects? Managing inherited projects can take a different approach compared to those you initiate and plan from the beginning of the project. Catalogers may initiate projects in alignment with professional interests as well as institutional priorities, but may also inherit projects as a result of staff turnover, retirements, reorganizations, and in my case, when you accept a new job. Managing in-progress projects, projects that were envisioned, pre-planned, and planned by others, call for different skills and steps compared to managing projects you initiate. What I hope to share with you today is what has worked for me to manage 2 projects I inherited more than 4 years ago, and how I've managed time, resources, and people to complete these projects with ownership. And now an obligatory caveat. This is not a project management workshop, and I'm not a certified project manager. In fact, there are folks in this community that are much more qualified and skilled to talk about project management standards and principles. My presentation will touch on stages in project management, but this is not a project management 101 type session. I will refer to principles used in project management, but the purpose of this presentation is to give you tips and practical strategies for managing inherited projects. If you'd like to learn about project management, I recommend the Project Management Institute website. I've included the website in my resources list, which you will see at the end. Project management best practices recommend specific steps to consider during the 4 stages of project management. First stage is starting, initiating, or pre-planning the project. Second stage is planning the project, which is the stage where you create a project plan and form a project team. Third stage is implementing or executing the project according to the project plan. The last stage is assessment and completing the project. When you look at literature on project management, most assume that one person is starting, planning, executing, and closing the project. In other words, there's one project manager from the beginning to the end. In general, best practices and recommendations focus on what you should do during each of the 4 stages. What I have found in my experience is that these best practices don't always apply directly to inherited projects. For example, project management best practices recommend a project plan during the planning stage. What if you inherited a project without a project plan, outlining who is doing the work, who are the stakeholders who need to know about project updates, budget for the project, timeline, goals, communication plan, and so on. If these specifics aren't readily available to you as the new project manager, you may need to retroactively create a project plan to use going forward. What if you inherited a project with no proper documentation on workflows, which should have been documented during the pre-planning and planning stages? This type of situation would require you to pause and retroactively create workflow documents based on existing project documents. Workflow documents are extremely helpful when training and managing people as part of projects. What this also means is that contrary to an employer's expectation, you will not be able to hit the ground running on day 1 if you're managing a project that was envisioned, planned, and started by someone else. It may take weeks or months before you're ready to continue an in-progress project. So over the next few minutes, I hope to go through some practical steps and strategies that I have taken for managing 2 large-scale projects that I inherited when I accepted my current position over 4 years ago. The projects are now nearly completed, which is a good time to do this reflection. I'll briefly describe the projects I oversee before discussing specifics to consider for managing inherited projects. I also made some changes to project directions as the new project manager, and I'll talk more about that later. So as I mentioned earlier, I inherited 2 large-scale projects when I started my position. As a project manager, I managed the arrangement and description aspects of these projects. So a little bit about each project. The Lair Sheet Music Collection, which is a donation from John C. Lair, is a large sheet music collection covering popular music and songs from the late 1800s through the first half of the 20th century. Collection processing and metadata work is complete. The collection consists of nearly 10,000 pieces of vocal and instrumental sheet music. The project team was made up of 1 staff member with no formal music background or metadata experience, 1 student assistant with formal music background, but no metadata work experience, and myself as a project manager. Staff and student work is done, and most of the work to be done is at my level, which is reviewing subject headings supplied by staff and overall metadata review before making the collection metadata spreadsheet public. The School of Music Recordings collection is much more complex in nature as it's an ongoing project. We have finished processing and metadata entry for all transfers to date, the last date being February 2020. Up until the end of last month, the project had dedicated student support with a dedicated project team consisting of 1 student assistant with formal music background and myself as a project manager. Going forward, project work will be done seasonally with support from circulation students and myself continuing as the project manager. So here are some practical strategies and steps I've taken for managing inherited projects. I'll share examples from projects along the way. Talk to your colleagues. This is a no-brainer, but may not be the first step most people take for managing inherited projects. If the previous project manager is not available, meaning they have left the organization or they retired long before you came on board, talk to your colleagues, your supervisor, project team members if they are continuing with the project. It is important to have these conversations before you start working on the project. During these conversations, you will learn about how or why the project was created, what was the project hoping to accomplish, who else worked on the project, who else you should talk to get more information about the project. So this step as a first step can be very helpful. Stakeholders is a common word in project management literature. Stakeholders don't always need to have personal investment in the project. As an example, as a project manager for the School of Music Recordings collection, I had conversations with several Fine Arts Library Public Services colleagues to learn about what they would like to see as an outcome of the project, especially since they will likely respond to patron requests for collection items. But I also emphasized my role with the project, that I'm only responsible for collection arrangement and description, so that we have realistic expectations. You definitely want to talk to your supervisor to know what their goals are for the project. I included the previous project manager in parentheses here because that may not work in every situation. While you may want to reach out to them hoping for a favorable response, that may not go according to plan. Documentation. I simply cannot overemphasize the importance of documentation when you're a project manager. It's easy to procrastinate and say, I'll do this later, but this is a good habit to cultivate at the beginning of a project, whether you're starting one or executing a project initiated by someone else. If you've inherited a project with no documentation, this is a necessary step before you start doing any work. If you've expected to train others to do project work, this step is essential. Document your workflows, how metadata entry is done, how processing is done. Don't rely on your own memory, as you may find yourself having to train a new student during the course of the project, especially if it's ongoing in nature. Documentation is necessary for consistent work and standardizing processes. So for the sheet music collection project, I was very fortunate to have good documentation from my predecessor, Carrie Bonack. She had created a metadata application profile for the collection, which I continued with when I took over as the project manager. So let's start project plan. If you've never seen one or created a project plan, you can start by Googling project management plan or project charter. You may have heard of Gantt charts, Gantt, Gantt charts, which is a type of project plan in a timeline format. Like I mentioned before, a project plan is created during the planning stage when you document project goals, outcomes, deliverables, scope of the project, budget, communication plan, project team and their responsibilities, and a timeline for completing the project. These are the essentials, and depending on the nature of the project, especially if it's grant funded, there may be additional details to note. A project plan is intended to guide project work. If you've inherited a project with no project plan, my personal recommendation is to take the time to create one before you start work. Functions like a checklist to guide project activities, and it's one of those things that will help later with assessment and report writing at the end of the project. Project team. The two projects I inherited had unique project teams in place. When I took over the layer sheet music collection project, there was one staff member assigned to the project, but that person announced retirement within several months, and I needed to hire new personnel. I was also hiring a project student assistant at the same time. This was a good time to rethink which skills need to be included in project team members and prioritize hiring a student assistant with music background. This also proved to be a good decision as the staff member hired did not have formal music background. In the end, the new project team for the sheet music collection had one full-time staff member with 30% of their time dedicated to the project and one part-time graduate music student, which led to collection processing and metadata entry being completed in about 3 years. If you find yourself in a position where you're being asked to manage a project with no staff or student support, I recommend you advocating for a project team. Your institution may not have the budget to hire a full-time staff member, but there may be other ways to request dedicated staff time or a student position to help with project management. Goals, deliverables, and timelines. This next one is tied to the project plan, which I talked about earlier. If you decide to implement or execute a project without an official project plan, I encourage you to at least come up with project goals and deliverables, as well as a possible timeline before you start working on the project. These will help you and the rest of the project team to stay on track and meet project milestones along the way. This is especially important for ongoing projects and large-scale projects with unknown quantities. Goals and deliverables are easy to determine during the early stages of projects, but timelines may be difficult to predict for large-scale projects and ongoing projects. So for the sheet music collection, my goal was to process the sheet music collection, create metadata in a spreadsheet format using modified doubling core, and have a deliverable of a searchable spreadsheet available for public access. As far as the timeline, I had hoped to finish the project in December 2020, but the timeline inevitably got extended due to the pandemic. Despite COVID delays and interruptions due to remote work, staff and student work were completed in April 2021. For the School of Music Recordings collection, I estimated similar goals for processing collection items and metadata entry with a deliverable of a searchable collection inventory spreadsheet. The timeline established was only for processing the backlog of unprocessed items. Since it's an ongoing collection, the timeline will be ongoing as well. Oops. And finally, be willing to clearly communicate changes to project directions. If you end up changing the scope of the project or outcomes of the project as the new project manager, I'll share some changes I made to both projects as the new project manager. I did not make any scope changes or project direction changes to the sheet music collection other than responsibilities at project team member level. Under the previous project manager, processing and transcription were done at staff level with work designated as low priority. And the project manager was responsible for reviewing staff work and adding subjects. So it was only a 2-person project team. When I took over as a project manager, I changed responsibilities at various levels. For example, the student was responsible for processing the collection in folders and transcribing metadata from items. New staff was hired with 30% of their time for project work. They were responsible for reviewing student work and adding subjects. I created a list of terms appropriate for subject analysis of vocal music in a popular music sheet music collection. And I will review staff work and overall collection metadata decisions. Delegating responsibilities have allowed me to focus on higher level decisions and the rest of the project team to engage in collection processing and description. When I took over as the project manager for the School of Music Recordings collection, I made several changes. I felt empowered to do so because the project was still in an exploratory stage under my predecessor. Even though the project manager role was inherited, I approached the project almost as if it's a new project because there was a lot of flexibility to change directions. The main change I made was to abandon item level catalog records and go with a modified doubling core schema for metadata entry in a spreadsheet format. As a deliverable, I prioritized a comprehensive collection inventory to assist public services folks with reference requests. My responsibilities as project manager are limited to physical collection processing and metadata entry, which also meant that I could keep the scope of the project fairly narrow. I kept my colleagues informed about changes and also planned project meetings to discuss changes and get their input. As long as you're clearly communicating changes to others, people will not oppose your professional judgment as the project manager. So hopefully you are able to learn something new during this session and think about steps to consider for inherited projects. I hope this was also helpful to folks currently managing projects and are thinking about how to transfer those to others as part of retirements and other staff separations. So here are some resources I've been consulted for managing my own projects. And thank you.